Thanks, Darren, and thank you to the ITU for inviting me to this conference. It's been really interesting, and I've learned a lot, and it's a real honor to be part of the panel with these esteemed scientists. So I have to start with a bit of conflict of interest stuff, because I've been naughty. I've been funded by the World Anti-Doping Agency in the past for some of the research that it may be sort of touched on later on. And also the I'm actually a member of the US Anti-Doping Agency Anti-Doping Review Panel, so you can see that I'm biased sort of against doping. I think doping is bad. I last year was a consultant for GlaxoSmithKline. They make some of the puffers used in asthma. I'm not really going to be talking much about puffers, but if you're looking for bias, there might be some. My real bias is that I really think exercise is good, and perhaps I'm overly biased that. I think we should all exercise, and we should even exercise a bit when it's polluted out. But we'll talk a bit about the science there. Hopefully you guys are a little bit biased in favor of exercise as well, if you've come to this meeting. We all know that exercise is really wonderful. It's good for preventing cancer, reducing heart disease, stroke, improving cognitive function. So hopefully you all believe that exercise is good. On the other hand, air pollution is bad. Sometimes I give these talks and I just can't get the message across, so I'm going to say it many times that air pollution is bad. I gave this talk on platelet-rich plasma, which is this treatment we use to treat tendons, and I was trying to give all the evidence, which is very weak for platelet-rich plasma, and kind of saying that maybe you should start with physical therapy. At the end of the talk, people were lined up asking me how much it costs for me to do the platelet-rich plasma injection. So I'm trying to really get the point across that air pollution, no matter what I say today, air pollution is bad, and we need to avoid it if we can. Now, this is just a little example. I'm from Vancouver here on the left. I took this picture on a summer day, and this is what Vancouver looks like in the summer. This is true. It actually does look like this. It rains for 9 other months of the year. But if you look on that picture on the left, there is not a ton of visible air pollution there. This is way up in the valley. It's a little bit smoggy there. It's just because the prevailing winds come from the west all the way up the valley, and it gets trapped by the gorgeous mountains. So air pollution is not typically a big deal in Vancouver. I took this picture this summer on a training ride. This is Vancouver. This was a period of 2 weeks where we could not see the sky. Okay, so that sort of gray-orange stuff, that's where the sky is supposed to be, but it's not there. And the reason we have that this summer, and actually more and more frequently in the summer, is that we have a lot of wildfires, forest fires in British Columbia. And British Columbia is quite big and is covered in forests, and so we can have more than 100 fires going at once, and they're not easy to control. And so they pump a lot of particulate matter into the sky, and so we can have high air pollution levels. Kind of related to that, a couple years ago, the Lake Tahoe Ironman was canceled for because of forest fires as well. So even we always think of sort of the super polluted cities of the world, like Delhi or Beijing or Bangkok, but even in less polluted cities, we do have to deal with air pollution at times, especially in the setting of triathlon. As coaches or practitioners, what do we tell our athletes? How do we adjust their training program? What do we do? And I'm going to talk a little bit later on about athletes with asthma, because there's a very high prevalence of asthma in endurance athletes. We get some mixed messages from the media. So top left, we've got a guy running the Beijing Marathon in a respirator. Thumbs up. That's all good. Okay. That doesn't look good and healthy to me. But then there's this article, exercising when air pollution levels are high can do more harm than good. Okay, so that's a clear message. And then we have the exact opposite message here. This is from the Globe and Mail. Dirty air affecting your health? Pedal harder. So what do we do with that? Well, I'll give you a bit of background. Air pollution, you should think of it like a recipe. If you're baking a cake or cookies or something like that, you put in a little bit of the liquid stuff, a little bit of solid stuff. Every recipe is different, and really air pollution is different in different situations, in different cities, at different times, and different times of the day. The recipe keeps changing. but it is a recipe. And it's a mix of gases. The key ones are ozone, really irritating to the lungs, carbon monoxide, naturally that's not good for performance. And then the big ones that are also quite irritating are oxides of nitrogen, nitrogen dioxide and nitric oxide. And then the stuff that makes us unable to see the sky in Vancouver is particulate matter. Particles of varying size that are created by industry, by internal combustion engines, by forest fire, by dust. Always think of air pollution as a recipe. And every study they have, when they're studying research, doing research on air pollution, they have to use one recipe. And it's important to consider how they've chosen the recipe and what recipe they're using. Okay, so when we do research, and part of my job is to do air pollution research and really try to figure out the interaction between air pollution, which is bad, and exercise, which is good. There's three ways to study it. You can do epidemiology. Whoops, I screwed up. You can do epidemiology studies where you have a very large sample size. You can have tens of thousands of study participants, and you can follow them over 10 to 20 years. And these studies are quite powerful because of the large sample size, because you have data over a long period of time, but also because you often have real health outcomes. They look at things like heart attacks, strokes, hospital admissions, and even mortality. So those are, from a healthcare point of view, those are real outcomes. Then one other type of study is called is a real-world acute exposure. And here's an example of one. This is a study we did a few years ago. This is a map of Vancouver, and we had bicycle commuters commute the same distance for the same amount of time through the downtown core in a high pollution zone, and then in a low pollution zone. And so the best thing about these studies are they get the recipe for air pollution right. You don't have to make it, you don't have to add the right amount of ozone and stuff, because they're using real air pollution in a real city, and it's the actual exposure that the participant would be experiencing. So that's nice. When you're studying Vancouver, often the air pollution, the difference between high air pollution and low pollution isn't really that high because the high isn't super high. You can't, just like that with the heat studies we were learning about, you can't really blind these people. They are riding their bicycle. They will be able to tell that they're in the leafy green residential area or getting run over by a bus downtown. And so that's always an issue. So you've got real air pollution, but no blinding. And then you have what we call surrogate outcomes. So if we do this study right, we can't measure heart attacks and mortality because we won't get people into the study. So we have to measure other things, symptoms, lung function, blood vessel function. And blood vessel function is sort of an important marker or predictor of some of the bad cardiovascular disease. If you have poor blood vessel function, if your blood vessels don't respond in terms of dilating and constricting in terms of demand for blood, then you're more likely to have things like a heart attack or a stroke. And then there's the third model. This is probably the one we do the most of, and this is an acute laboratory exposure. So we have this participant here. He's cycling on a Velotron, which is kind of a science-y CompuTrainer, and he's breathing exhaust from this chamber here, and we can measure a lot of parameters. So the nice thing about it is the recipe that you give this person is very controlled. And there's actually an engineer that's monitoring the pollution while we're doing it, and making sure that what we were trying to give these people was 300 micrograms per cubic meter of something called particulate matter 2.5. It's about the size of the particles. And so every participant in the study got the same recipe of air pollution. But that's the recipe that we were using on that day. It's slightly different. And how do we generate the air pollution? It's really basically a super science-y Honda generator. And there's a lot of sort of science in between the generator and his mouth, but he is breathing exhaust from a diesel generator. We did have ethics for that. It was surprisingly easy to get. We just said that this massive dose was the same as riding the tube in London during rush hour. and they were okay with that. I think they had more problem with the font that we used for the ethics application. So it's very controlled, but you're blind, and the blinding is not bad. You think one day he comes in and he's sucking on a tailpipe, and the other day he's breathing filtered air. But the good thing is the lab stinks. The lab smells like diesel. You wear these masks, it's all really kind of plasticky and stuff. And the participants are surprisingly poor at telling the difference. You don't have long-term results, right? Those epidemiological studies, you can follow people for 20 years and see how the air pollution affects them. And also, again, you only have these surrogate outcomes, symptoms, lung function, blood vessel functions. You don't have, hopefully, any mortality to report. When we got into this, this is actually the lab of my colleague Chris Carlston. He's a respirologist in Vancouver, and the design was actually have the cyclists in that booth here. This is a little booth designed for exercise. But when you're doing hospital respirology research, exercise is basically walking to you, and we're trying to do exercise that is relevant for the people in the room here. So hard, intense exercise. And pretty quickly we found that when we put the athlete in the chamber, when they're exercising, something happens. What happens? Any guesses? Heart rate goes up, yeah? Anything else? Think Stephen Chung, that's your big hint. Gets really, really hot. And we all know that heat is really bad for you during exercise, heat and pollution together. When you study them, we can't figure out if they're feeling poorly because their core temperature's gone up 1.5 degrees or because of the air pollution. So we had to sort of reconfigure everything and pull them out of the chamber. But while we were doing that, we wanted to look at what exposure to pollution does before the exercise. And this is represents you commuting to your group track workout or commuting to your event in air pollution. Often your athletes will do that on their bike. And so this was sort of an interesting study we wanted to look at. And we found the biggest results actually when we look at air pollution before exercise, not during exercise. And we only found a couple things. When people exercise, during exercise, their airways of their lungs open up without any medication or anything, and your lung function improves. And so if you look at the white bars here, these are the filtered air exposure, and this is during exercise. So during exercise, this marker here, FEV1, is a marker of lung function. With filtered air, we had an improvement in lung function just because of exercise. Because remember, exercise is good. When we gave them the diesel exhaust, we didn't have a worsening of lung function. We just didn't have that improvement in lung function. We also found that their performance during exercise, they were doing a time trial, wasn't really affected. But we did find that for the same wattage, their heart rate was a little bit higher. So these are small effects, a lack of improvement in lung function, a slight increase in heart rate, but they are worse in the diesel condition. So that's the air pollution exposure outside of the exercise, and that's interestingly where we're finding a bigger difference than during exercise. This is just a little summary. The main sort of performance outcomes that we were expecting to see, we didn't. We just saw the increase in heart rate and then the lack of improvement in lung function with exercise. So really, with your athletes, pay attention to their pre-event exposure. Okay, so if it's at a major games, getting from the village to the competition site, often that can take a long period of time and the traffic can be quite bad, even if they have the special IOC lanes and all that kind of thing. But it's something really to think about. When I got into this game, we wanted to look at pollution at the same time as exercise. We've done both models, the ride around the residential or the downtown area, or suck on a tailpipe. And one of the things that we looked at that I mentioned already was this blood vessel function. So blood vessel function is measured many different ways, and we measured it in actually 2 different ways in these 2 different studies. But if you are sedentary, or you have high blood pressure, or you have diabetes, poor cholesterol, all these things lead to impairment in your blood vessel function. If you do exercise, that improves your blood vessel function. If you have poor blood vessel function, you're more at risk of having cardiovascular disease. So during exercise, with two different methods of measuring blood vessel function, we exposed people to either laboratory air pollution or real air pollution, and we couldn't see a difference. We were surprised at that. But one of the things we really wanted to look at is exercise intensity. A lot of the previous studies have what we would call extremely low exercise intensity as the exercise bout, and that's not relevant for the people in this room. The other thing is, if you have somebody who's riding their bike to work or riding their bike to an event on a high pollution day, should they take it easy and not work so hard, but be exposed to the pollution for a longer period of time? Or should they get on their bike and just pin it and work hard but not be exposed to the air pollution? And so before we started doing this, we thought there was a lot of reasons why the high-intensity exercise would lead to more of a detrimental pollution effect. And it's quite simple. When you're exercising hard, you're breathing more, right? So your dose of air pollution is going to be higher. Also, when you're exercising hard, you don't use your nose as much. You breathe through your mouth. Your nose isn't there just for looks. It actually is a filter and humidifies the air and can take some of the particulate out. So when we're going hard on our bike or running and breathing through our mouth, we're bypassing that filter. So you'd think that's another reason for your pollution dose to be even higher. You're taking bigger breaths, so when we're thinking of particles, we expect them to be deposited deeper in the lungs, further down the bronchial tree. And then during exercise, your metabolism is higher by definition, and so there may be some effects of that. So we had all these great reasons why more intense exercise would lead to more bad effects of air pollution. We took 18 recreationally active males. So these guys, their VO2 is about 55. So certainly not elite triathletes, but also these are active people that cycle most of the time. And more importantly, they were motivated enough to work hard on the bike when we asked them to. And to come back to the lab for 7 visits, 3 of them sucking on a tailpipe. And so just briefly, we familiarized them to the setup. We determined their fitness, and we had them either breathing filtered air or diesel at either rest, low intensity, and high intensity exercise. And what's high intensity exercise? What we used for that was 60% of the power at VO2 peak. And so that's how we measure. We do at the end of the VO2 max, we figure out their power output and take 60% of that. If you wanted to convert that to their FTP or their threshold, it's probably something like 85% of their threshold. Some of them couldn't or had a lot of trouble finishing the 30 minutes at that. So although 60% doesn't sound so intense, it was a pretty intense and near maximal effort for some of them. So we looked at a bunch of things. We looked at lung function, exercise performance, how they felt, the rating of perceived exertion. We measured norepinephrine or noradrenaline, depending where you're coming from, marker of sympathetic stress, and we measured the blood vessel function by something called flow-mediated dilatation. We also measured heart rate variability. So if you're putting these people through all those things, all this sort of stress, you want to do a lot of testing on them. We didn't find a lot. One of the things that we found is this is ventilation. So how much you're breathing. White is filtered air, black is diesel. And so they're breathing the same amount at rest in both conditions, and during high-intensity exercise, they were breathing the same amount. There was a difference. They're actually breathing more in the diesel during the low-intensity exercise. Also, their metabolic rate, their VO2, their oxygen consumption, was higher during the low-intensity exercise. They did have more symptoms in the diesel than the filtered air. So we asked them about how short of breath they felt and how crappy their legs felt. And overall, it was worse in the diesel than in the filtered air, which you'd expect. But all the other things that we were looking at in terms of the performance effects, we really didn't see anything there. We looked at this plasma norepinephrine, and what we found was that intense exercise caused a big increase in norepinephrine, but when we looked at it, diesel versus filtered air, there's no difference. That's the diesel versus filtered air at the 3 exercise intensities. When we looked at performance, we didn't see much difference at all. And in terms of lung function post-exercise, there was not much difference. So the only difference that we're seeing is an increase in metabolic rate in the low intensity, but not the high intensity exercise. So when you do this and it's unexpected, what you do is you think, okay, we've done something wrong, and you go back and you look at everything, make sure that they got the pollution on the high pollution days, and we couldn't find anything that we did wrong. But then a group out of Barcelona did a neat study. This is a real-world study funded by Coca-Cola for some reason. There's no Coca-Cola at any point in this study, so you can't accuse them of bias. Coca-Cola related bias, I guess. And so what they did is they had people on a highway overpass on a stationary bike, and they measured a lot of the same stuff that we did, and they did it during a high pollution time and a low pollution time. So compared to our study, we have sort of a fake mix of air pollution, which is just sort of modified exhaust from a diesel generator. It still has particulate and carbon monoxide, but in this study, they're using real air pollution. The amount of air pollution that they were able to get wasn't quite as high, but it's real-world air pollution. So there's advantages to both, right? And they basically found the same stuff that we found. That so see, we were having 300 micrograms per cubic meter. They only had 80 micrograms per cubic meter. But again, they're having real air pollution in this study. But when they looked at lung function, lung inflammation, and symptoms, they really didn't find much difference either. So that was encouraging. And then remember at the very beginning I was talking about the different models of researching air pollution. Epidemiological studies can be quite powerful because you have a lot of people in the study and you have real outcomes like mortality or hospital visits. And so this study was done in Copenhagen. And what they did is they figured out where everybody lived and what the levels of oxides of nitrogen, which is a key pollutant, were where they lived. And they also figured out how much exercise these people did, and they followed them for many years. And what they found was that exercise is good, and that when people did more exercise, they had less mortality, less cardiovascular disease. And they found that the air pollution didn't modify that. So these people, if they're living in a high air pollution part of Copenhagen and they're exercising, they still got the benefits of exercise. Exercise is good. I'm not trying to say air pollution is good, but it seems that it's, in the battle, exercise just seems to have more power than air pollution. So in 3 different types of studies, laboratory, real world, and epidemiological studies, we're kind of seeing that in this battle, exercise is kind of winning, but remember my bias. What about training indoors? Some of you may know who this is. This is a famous Canadian triathlete who famously does a lot of training indoors, on a bike, on a treadmill, and then with a indoor swimming pool flume thing. And training indoors is part of a solution in terms of reducing air pollution, but there are pollution considerations indoors as well. New buildings and new carpets and new furniture, they off-gas chemicals. Something very important in Canada is this thing. It's called a Zamboni. It's a ice resurfacing machine, and these things pump out a lot of particulate matter. And there's actually a nice study that shows that kids playing ice hockey over the course of their ice hockey career and Zamboni exposure, their prevalence of asthma increases. Again, I'm from Vancouver, and Vancouver is the land of Lululemon. If you haven't heard of Lululemon, it's high-end yoga wear. And so people just walk around with yoga mats and coffee everywhere. And except, this is a totally aside, nothing to do with air pollution, yoga causes lots of injuries. I would say it's the sport causing the second most injuries that I see in the clinic, and I'm not kidding. So really, the take-home message is be careful with the yoga. If you're doing your yoga right, there's a lot of candles there and some incense and stuff, and all of those give off particulate matter. Also, if you're into cross-country skiing, the waxing, that even with the low fluoro waxes, the sort of cheap cross-country ski waxes, they can give off a lot of indoor air pollution. So outdoors or indoors, you can still be exposed to it. We tried to manage this during the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver. We had an electric ice resurfacing machine for the long track speed skating, but it broke down, and so they had to whip out the old internal combustion Zamboni and to save the day. We're supposed to talk about the pathways in triathlon. It's really hard to talk about the junior development pathways in terms of air pollution because other than studies of asthma prevalence in high air pollution, we know kids exposed to high air pollution get more asthma. There aren't any sort of air pollution and exercise at the same time studies in that group. All the research that we present today, they're 19 years of age and older. And actually, I haven't done yet, and I need to, work in people over 40. So we don't have a lot of data in terms of the youth and the older age groupers. We have some preliminary data that was showing that there's sort of a tendency for the women to have more of an impairment in endothelial function, and then the older people in that 19 to 39 age group might be more at risk, but that really needs to be looked at more. In sort of an interim summary for people that got lost, I usually get lost in everyone else's presentation, so I really put these in for me. We see with air pollution exposure during exercise, we see an increase in ventilation, breathing, increase in oxygen consumption, but not worse in high-intensity exercise, which we would have expected. And we don't see the effects of air pollution on norepinephrine or blood vessel functions. And so we haven't seen any evidence that higher intensity is worse. We did see bigger effects in air pollution exposure outside of the exercise bout. So as much as possible, try to minimize that during high pollution days. And with your athletes, even if they can have a shorter commute or maybe a commute in a car or a bus with the windows open or something like that, that may be better than running to the track on a high pollution day. I'm going to talk a little bit about asthma just because it's such a high prevalence in endurance athletes. In fact, one of the things we can't really figure out in sports science is that in terms of Olympic medals, asthmatics are overrepresented. So people that have been diagnosed with asthma seem to get almost double the Olympic medals than non-asthmatics. And one of the things that says, and we know, is that over the course of an endurance athlete's career, there's an increase in prevalence of asthma. So it's probably related to that. But asthma is very prevalent in endurance sports. We see every time Chris Froome pulls a puffer out, the Twitter goes nuts. And so we need to sort of take into account asthmatic athletes in the air pollution question. So again, air pollution is bad, right? And chronic exposure to air pollution makes asthma worse. Kids exposed to it have an increase in prevalence of asthma. Ozone, one of the gas components of air pollution, reduces lung functions in some studies. And the acute exposure studies need to be done. We've just finished data collection and preliminary analysis on one where we're comparing asthmatics in filtered air versus diesel with asthma medicine versus with placebo, sort of 4 arms to try and see if taking the asthma medicine helps or not. Because if you think about it, when someone takes a bronchodilator, that opens up their airways, and that might actually get the pollution and the particulates deeper into their lungs. So no one's ever really looked at that. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. We're doing a lot of work of breathing, which takes a lot of analysis that I don't understand. So that analysis hasn't been completed. We just have the symptomatic symptom findings, and these are all asthmatics, and this is shortness of breath, and it's pretty close between the diesel and the filtered air, and leg discomfort, pretty close. So that's only very preliminary data, and we almost saw more of effect in the healthy individuals. Stay tuned on that. We're going to have more to report on that. However, there's a nice paper from my PhD supervisor, Don McKenzie, in 2008, which is all about asthmatics and competition and sort of managing the symptoms. And these are symptoms that people will have on exposure at rest during high air pollution: cough, sore throat, nasal symptoms, eyes and skin symptoms. And these are some of the recommended strategies. They pretty well all come down to hydration. Put drops in your eyes, keep your hydration good, moisturize your skin. They do recommend inhaled steroids and bronchodilators and mast cell stabilizers, asthma medications for asthmatics. And this is, at this point, expert opinion. And I definitely would recommend your asthmatics take their asthma medication, because remember, the air pollution isn't only during exercise, it's 24 hours a day often. And so if we can minimize the symptoms and minimize the worsening of the asthma, I think that's a good place to start. So although we're studying this, for now I think this is a good recommendation. Another interim summary, just for me. So chronic pollution makes asthma prevalence, the number of people that have asthma, increase, and it makes it more severe. We don't know specifically about acutely what's happening during exercise in asthmatics, but they are going to be exposed to pollution outside of exercise, and we want to manage their symptoms as much as possible. With any medications, asthma medications have implications in terms of the WADA code. There's only a select number of bronchodilators, and so always with all medications, think about the code, work with your physician or whatever, just to make sure that you're compliant with that code, because you don't want to make a silly mistake there. This is a bit of an aside, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit about overtraining and part of the afternoon's future-proofing session. In my practice, when I see people with overtraining, a lot of the time it's not because of their training load going up quickly or their training stress going up quickly. Maybe that's maintained. It's when there's another stress, non-training stress, put on top of that. Family member dies, relationship difficulties, school stress. Their training load is constant, but then you add this other non-training stress. We learned that sort of lack of recovery is a key component to overtraining yesterday. Well, if you have a lot of non-training stress, you're studying for exams or you're not sleeping because of all that, you're not going to recover well. So pollution, air pollution is a stress, but it is often combined with a lot of other stresses: noise, traffic. Riding your bicycle in downtown London is not a relaxing experience. So I don't have a formula to modify your TSS with this, but take into account non-training stress. And if someone is in an unfamiliar environment that's high air pollution, that is a stress to take into account. There are tools that are helpful. Unfortunately, they're different in every jurisdiction. This is the British website that gives guidance on air pollution. Whatever your jurisdiction is that you're living in or going to compete in, there will be some sort of air quality index or air quality health advisory that gives a little bit of guidance for it. I really like this app. It's called Plume, like a feather, and it's out of Paris, and it has air quality data for pretty well everywhere I've ever been, and it's nice because it also predicts the future. So looking at historical data and weather, they give you a sense of how the air pollution is going to be later in the day. They actually have guidance. So right here, if you click on the bicycle, it says don't go hard on the bicycle today, right now during this high pollution time. We actually spoke with the folks at Plume about this, and this is based on gut feel, but it's reasonable. The best part is that you can predict, because the sort of practical part of this, the take-home message is, well, the big take-home message is exercise is good, pollution is bad. Avoid pollution as much as possible. And this is the key. Separate yourself from pollution by time, right? So if we go back and we look at, what was this? This was Vancouver. Early in the day, low pollution. Late in the day, low pollution. And so if you can move your training sessions around, on a high pollution day to minimize the exposure. Get out early, get out late in the day, or if it has to be in the middle of the day, maybe move it indoors if it's a reasonably controlled environment. You can do that. So separate your athletes or yourself from the pollution by time and also by distance. So if you're right next to a bus, it's a high air pollution situation. But within a few meters of that bus, the air pollution dose drops dramatically. In Vancouver, what we have is the car and bus traffic, and then we have the parked cars, and then we have the bike lanes to just add about 2 to 3 meters between the cyclists and the buses, specifically for that reason. And it makes a difference. The problem is that people are in the parked cars in between the buses and the bike lanes, so they get out of the car and they get whacked by a fixie. And so that's another problem. So separate by distance. If you can, you've got a track workout with your athletes. If it can be in a more of a residential area, that's going to make a big difference. Even if you're in a big city, the residential track versus the downtown track, there will be a difference in pollution dose. So these are simple things to deal with. On high pollution day, really see bigger font, pay attention to that pre-event exposure, because that is important. Do whatever you can to minimize that. Because the increase in intensity doesn't seem to be a problem, and if you have to get a training session in and you have that choice of the very long base ride or some really short interval work, it might make more sense to do the more shorter intense stuff. If you can move it to a better environment, do it. And then in athletes with respiratory disease like asthma, extra care, especially when they're traveling. Make sure they have their medications with them. Make sure that they have the right ones from a WADA point of view. Make sure they have extras, because if they lose their medications at a big event, they're going to be symptomatic, but they're also going to be stressed out about it. So just things like that. I'm going to talk really quickly about warm-ups because it's something that's underemphasized in relation to asthma and in terms of air pollution. In the past, I did a bunch of studies trying to prove that asthma medications were ergogenic. Asthma medications could improve your performance. And we did these studies. We couldn't even prove that asthma medicines improve performance in asthmatics, right? We could improve their lung function, but they couldn't do a time trial any better. And we couldn't figure that out. But one of the things that we really realized is that we gave these athletes a wonderful warm-up before their time trial event. And a warm-up is really effective at reducing lung symptoms in people who have exercise-induced bronchoconstriction. It's kind of a weird graph actually, but this is a 1-minute exercise bout in someone who's had a warm-up and then in someone who hasn't. And this is lung function on the left column here. And you can just see that there's a big drop in lung function without the warm-up. So we're in Edmonton. There's a scientist here, Mike Stickland from the University of Alberta. He did a really nice meta-analysis. You guys are getting sick of these forest plots, I'm sure. But what he did is he took all the studies of warm-ups and he broke them down into different types of warm-up. And the one that we sort of, the old school warm-up, sort of nicely ease into it, long, low-intensity warm-up. That one, that's here, the continuous low-intensity warm-up. That's the one that sort of intuitively would work. Wasn't really as effective as this sort of interval variable intensity warm-up. So the sort of ultimate warm-up strategy to prevent lung symptoms is 5 to 7 30-second high-intensity bouts, 80 to 90% of your maximal intensity, and then rests of about 2 minutes in between. So if you do the math, this is a 20 to 30-minute warm-up, right? And so that's a big deal. But if it's a short, intense competition like a sprint or a super sprint triathlon, it's worth doing this. And this is effective at reducing symptoms in your asthmatic athletes. We don't talk about it enough. We always just sort of dive to the medications, but the warm-up is important. So think about that with those athletes, especially if they're going to be exposed to air pollution, which should make their symptoms worse. So in summary, look at those air pollution levels in your area or get the Plume app and avoid pollution as much as possible. Separate by time and space if you can. Really think of that, time and space. And then consider shorter, more intense workouts, move it to a better environment, and be careful with athletes with respiratory disease. Okay? And so these are some of my collaborators and students that worked on some of this work and some of the people that funded it. So thank you.
Thanks for entertaining and informative talk. Any questions for Dr. Koehle? Maybe I'll get it started with just a real quick one.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, does the size of the particulate matter? The particulate matter.
There's sort of three different sizes that they categorize it. The one that's associated with the most health effects is the PM 2.5. 2.5 is microns is the size. So if they're smaller than 2.5 microns. They come mostly from, nowadays they come mostly from internal combustion engines, trucks and diesel and that kind of thing. So that's probably the size. That's what we use to standardize. We standardize that, the 2.5, but because it's a diesel generator, we're getting a bit of 10, we're getting a bit of the smaller ones as well.
They had ever done a study to see whether overtraining was a bigger indicator of asthma rather than the pollution itself? Like, have they eliminated the pollution in the testing to see whether overly working that person past fatigue over and over is causing more of the lung problem?
I'm not aware of any specific studies that have sort of broken it down that way, but certainly there are the cross-country ski population. They're generally at least competing in a low pollution environment, and if they're good enough, they're not even waxing their own skis. They'll have a tech for that, and so they do have a very high incidence of it. Also, the ultimate model for that is the sled dogs, because a sled dog has a VO2 max of 240, and they actually they use them as the sort of model of exercise-induced asthma. They actually go and collect cells from their lungs post-Iditarod, and there's a ton of inflammation there. So I think the thought is that pollution is bad, but it's the high ventilation rates, the cooling and the drying of the airway over and over time that seems to cause that increase in prevalence of asthma, which is somewhat reversible. Some people, after they retire, become less symptomatic.
Thanks for your presentation. As a question that's kind of a combination of things, there are folks that are using basically live high, train low methods, with the train low then being basically a dilutional hyperoxic air mixture. Are there dangers associated with that high oxygen content respiration with regard to health of the lung tissue, et cetera?
Just to get a bit, don't go away. So I understand the question right. In a live high, train low, especially when you're just staying high and then using oxygen to simulate going low.
Correct.
What are the risks of that? So there is a thing called oxygen toxicity, which is related to sort of free radicals causing damage. But when you're breathing a high oxygen mixture at altitude, you're only bringing up the equivalent oxygen to maybe sea level. You're the equivalent of a sort of 21% at sea level. So you're not at risk of the oxygen toxicity with that. So other than it just being really dry, but it's going to be dry at altitude anyway, I can't think of any. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.